We now turn to one of our colleagues in Mundo Zoom, Sarah Dryden Peterson, the director of the REACH initiative at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Professor Dryden Peterson.
Thanks so much, Marcelo and Stefania. I hope you can hear me well, and please feel free to interrupt if you can't as we mix these hybrid worlds together. But I just wanted to begin by saying hello to all. Maybe now my camera is on, let's see. I hope so. And how wonderful it is to share time together today. I wanted to thank you for inviting me to join this conversation, and just delighted to be part of it, both listening to the presentations and the discussion itself. I wanted to begin with a question, this question here of what it would take to ensure that all young people have access to learning that enables them to feel a sense of belonging and prepares them to help build more peaceful and equitable futures. I see this question following so nicely from your thoughts, Stefania, and hope we can delve into some of the aspects of it. I work on this question mostly in context of conflict and migration, but I'm going to talk today about its resonance as we think about education in our current pandemic, likely future pandemics, and implications for the COVID-19 generation. Just for some brief context to begin with in terms of conflict and migration, so we can see some of the resonance. There are now almost 27 million refugees globally. This number of refugees has grown since World War II, and it continues to grow. Unfortunately, we expect these numbers to increase further with climate change, political instability, and ongoing conflict globally. Importantly, where refugees live is not distributed equitably globally. So for comparison, in 2017, 25% of the population in Lebanon was a refugee, compared to less than 0.1% in Canada, where I grew up. In 2019, only 1,198 refugees from Afghanistan were admitted to the United States, where I live now, while almost 1.5 million Afghan refugees continue to live in Pakistan, many for more than 20 years. 20 years. This kind of long-term displacement is a central dimension of refugee education, and I think it's deeply relevant as we think about the connections among conflict and pandemic in education. Once displaced, 80% of refugees are displaced for at least 5 years, and 20% for over 20 years, which is almost 3 times as long as it was in the early 1990s. This length of displacement means that exile is the one and only chance refugee children have for an education. It echoes the thoughts we hear often today of this is the normal that our COVID-19 generation are experiencing. Abroon, one of our research participants in Kenya, thought that he would quickly return to Somalia after he fled with his family, just like our children thought they would quickly return to school after 2 weeks, and then were out of school for almost a year and a half. But 21 years later, Abroon was still in Kenya. This expectation of short-term displacement, short-term disruption, but the reality of long-term displacement and long-term disruption is present for individual refugees, for individual students during the pandemic, and also for agencies making educational policy. As Raphael in Kakuma camp said, we can't keep talking about emergency. If people have been here for 20 years, so when you design things that are emergency in approach and in context, then you're not addressing my needs as I grow up. In my forthcoming book, Right Where We Belong, I expand on the ideas, these essential ideas, that refugees or education in any kind of disruption are not short-term emergency experiences. And also, particularly for refugees and in relation to migration, that these are transnational lives, and that these elements of long-term and transnational are essential to understanding educational experiences and the policies and practices that shape them. Across studies, what we have found is that while refugee policies are premised on punctuated migration trajectories, flight now, return when safe, most refugee young people are in processes of continual migration, shaped by shifting migration policies and also by the search for opportunities. Similarly, in pandemic times, Most students are experiencing continued, even if exacerbated, inequities. So how can education act on inequities that are exacerbated during times of disruption and uncertainty? Inequities in access, in learning, and in opportunity. When I began my work in refugee education, the dominant global narrative was that it was temporary, a kind of holding pattern until refugees could return to their countries of origin. This was unfortunately the same narrative that dominated early days of educational planning during the COVID pandemic. We see in refugee education, as we have seen around the world during COVID, that short-term and emergency education do not meet the purposes communities have for education during times of disruption. Education is never only about the here and now, as we've heard from so many speakers so far. Our long-term work in many places documents that refugees' experiences of forced displacement and migration and disruption result in a constant navigation of this triangle that I've put on the screen, connecting histories and long-term pasts to the dual imperative to live in the place and the moment where one is hosted, where one is experiencing disruption from the very moment that it happens, this kind of placemaking, while also connecting that placemaking to future building. Future building involves imagining and planning for multiple possible futures, here, there, and or somewhere else entirely. Processes that are not linear and not seeking some sedentary or arrived at geographic, spatial, or social state. There are massive legal, policy, and xenophobic constraints on refugees' access to resources and opportunities for placemaking and for future building. At the same time, refugee young people and their families describe how education can support navigation of these barriers, particularly the misalignments between schooling in the present and opportunities in the future. Again, relevant as we think about pandemic education. So how so? I want to situate thinking about this navigation among past, present, and future in a few conceptual ideas. One is negative and positive peace. Johann Galtung, drawing on earlier work of Martin Luther King Jr., describes the differences between negative peace, the absence of direct violence, and positive peace, the absence of structural violence. Positive peace is thus not only the absence of violence, but the presence of conditions that allow individuals to access equal opportunities. Refugee education and pandemic education have been framed often with the goal of negative peace, a kind of temporary holding ground to keep people safe until return to school was possible, but without accompanying conditions for learning, for belonging, and for opportunity. Another set of conceptual ideas is what these ideas of peace mean for experiences in schools, for kids and for teachers. Social theorist Nancy Fraser outlines how access to equal opportunities requires redistribution to counter resource-based inequalities and recognition to counter identity-based inequalities. In education, redistribution to address resource-based inequalities can often happen through macro and mesosystem policies. As we see in refugee education, a global policy adopted at national levels to include refugees in national education systems, or to widely distribute educational content via radio or standardized digital content during the pandemic. Yet, as I see across my work, addressing identity-based inequalities can be much more challenging to institutionalize, especially in settings where refugees or other young people don't have rights, experience more inequalities, and are outside national narratives of belonging, where standardized content does not meet individual needs. What I find, though, is that the possibilities of disrupting these identity-based inequalities are connected to perceptions of futures. From research with refugee students across contexts, we see that they largely reject the notion that they can conceptualize their futures geographically or in a historical moment in terms of nation states or this moment in time. But of course, this is how migration policies are conceptualized. While young people wish for more geographic certainty and more inclusive migration policies are essential, young people also pragmatically think through how little control they have over these kinds of policies. We have learned from them a different way to conceptualize futures and thus purposes and experiences of education in terms of opportunities. This means capacities to apply what one learns, wherever that may be, across place and across time, not having to choose between the present and the future, between the kinds of learning that are deemed worthy within the education one experiences in the present and in this specific geography and moment, and the opportunities that one might then trade away for a reimagined future. This framework relies less on education as bounded by geography or a moment in time, and more on education as an enabler of opportunity. I'm going to speak briefly now about one part of our work that addresses these ideas in school setting, for us to try to see what these practices look like in schools and how we might cultivate them, a focus on teachers, as Stefania just called for. To do this, I want to draw on a 4-year study with Syrian refugees in Lebanon that concludes in this year. This study is a collaborative one with Vidur Chopra at Teachers College, Columbia, and colleagues at the American University of Beirut, Carmen Geha and Jumana Talhouk, and Cindy Horst at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. We've also been working in this project in collaboration with a Syrian artist, Sasso Nourallah. These are her drawings that you see on the screen. I'm going to use a few more of her drawings to share findings from one of our case study schools. This is a public second shift school in Lebanon, meaning Lebanese children attend school in the morning and Syrian children in the afternoon, in the same school building with many of the same Lebanese teachers, but at different times of the day. One day, 2 Syrian students arrived to school to find a poster that they had made, ripped up and torn to pieces on the floor. The students, Munir and Mira, tried to talk to their teacher about what had happened. By way of explanation, the teacher said that the Lebanese students in the morning shift felt like Munir, Mira, and their friends were intruders on the school. This idea made Munir even more upset, and he said he wanted to rip up all of their work. It seemed only to make it worse when the principal told the class that maybe Lebanese students did this to the poster because, after all, it is their school first. Munir, upset as he was also resigned in some ways to this second-class status. As Mira said, that did make some sense. They're Lebanese and their school is Lebanese. For sure, there's no country that favors others over their own citizens, right? In Syria, we also have our own school and it's not theirs. Munir explained how this felt to him. It's like they're giving the school to us so we can learn, but not to be established. While he felt this way, he most often found these conversations closed for discussion, with his teacher saying things in response like, "Don't interfere with politics. We're here to study, not to talk about these issues." With this example from our data in mind, I wanted to come back to this triangle. The legal, social, and political positions of refugees within hosting countries creates gaps in the ways that education can support them in connecting histories, placemaking, and future building, further exacerbated during the pandemic. As Munir described, his education involves trade-offs, learning now, but with the impossibility of being established. What possibilities are there for positive peace when young people are included within schools while also marginalized from experiences of belonging and opportunity? We find that Syrian students attribute major roles to teachers in developing the kinds of navigational capacities to support connections among past, present, and future, particularly in contexts of uncertainty. Syrian young people described the structures and content of their schooling as barriers, but they connected teacher pedagogies and school relationships to their capacities to connect past, present, and future in ways that do begin to enable belonging and opportunity. The structures of schooling were a constant experience of being behind, having lost time in school because of war, having a hard time catching up with language, and literally coming to school later than, behind, Lebanese students every day. Compounding this feeling of being behind was the feeling of being intentionally kept separate from Lebanese students in this kind of segregation in morning and afternoon shifts. The structures set up a feeling of being unwanted. On content, overall, refugee students describe how they feel left out of curriculum that does not pertain to them, an experience common not only to refugees, but those marginalized in places in which they are citizens. For example, in a civics lesson on respecting public servants, a Syrian student raised that his father had faced insults when trying to renew the family's residency permits. The student questioned whether such public service warranted respect. The civics teacher smiled sheepishly, and then the bell rang, marking not just the end of the period, but also implicitly communicating that there was little time to bring personal experiences into a formal curriculum that was disconnected from students' lives. Students found that effective teachers supported them to overcome these fixed structures and content of schooling through pedagogical approaches, especially those that enabled them to make sense of the disconnects in their experiences of being included in a national school, but excluded from the curriculum they were learning. One student shared how her civics teacher motivated students to become part of society, to have greater importance and not just be on the margins. The teacher reminded the students that with civics, they might be able to change other people's perspectives. Then, acknowledging the dissonance between this optimism for students as agents of change and their limited power as refugees and as students, the student recalled how this teacher admitted that, in the end, nothing of what's in this lesson exists. We wish it does. But the teacher went on, encouraging students about the future. It's true you're learning things that don't exist, but you might be the reason they exist in the future. You might do things related to politics, and you can change and do the things you studied about. Students connected opportunities for these pedagogies to relationships with teachers, especially ones based in respect, care, trust, support, and open communication. Students described how these kinds of relationships supported them explicitly in reconciling their current placemaking in the fixed geography and the uncertainty of pandemic conditions, and their future building, focused on what they hoped would be a less confined opportunity. In important ways, this was about making them feel welcome. As one student said, the teachers, didn't at all make us feel that we were entering a country that isn't ours. Students valued relationships in which you feel like someone listening to you. In our data, we see refugee students value teachers who use relationships as the foundation of their pedagogy and support them to navigate the fixed content and structures of schooling by way of this relational pedagogy, even in uncertain times. In new work, we call this relational pedagogy in refugee education pedagogies of belonging. One of my greatest learning experiences over the past 2 years has been to redesign the course I used to teach on education in armed conflict to one with a broader focus on education in uncertainty, responding to pandemic conditions as well, and to design the course around these pedagogies of belonging. It has helped me to learn both how very, very hard this work is as a teacher, and also how powerful it is for student learning. Our research finds that young people describe these pedagogies as important to them as they seek to build their futures, unknowable and uncertain as these futures are, with relevance for the continued educational, economic, and political uncertainty so many students continue to face in the context of the COVID pandemic. With my team, we're continuing to explore some of the very same big questions that Stefania outlined about how teachers learn these pedagogies, the institutional and policy conditions that enable them, and the long-term trajectories of students, with implications for all of our millions of students globally who are experiencing uncertainty and disruption and need the kinds of long-term and future-building structures, pedagogies, and relationships that can support them now and into these futures. Thank you, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion.